Hey, welcome this week to the Art, Music, and Technology podcast. I'm glad that you're able to join. This week represents a little bit of an embarrassment for me. I was working with Christopher Biggs, who's the person we interviewed, and I was really excited to get him interviewed earlier this spring. I did the interview, and then I promptly lost the recording. Well, doing some archival work in the previous weeks, I ran across the interview. There were a few things that were out of date. I took care of those. The rest of the discussion, though, was so intriguing, I was really excited to be able to bring it to you. So there you go. That's what we're going to have this week. I want to thank this week's sponsor, SPLICE.com. SPLICE.com has been sponsoring the last few episodes, and I really appreciate that a lot. I want to ask you to please help out the podcast by jumping over to their site. You can go to a special link that we have set up. It's splice.com/artmusictech-music. If you want, you can jump over to our podcast page, which is artmusictech.libsyn.com. And I will have a link there for you to be able to hit. But if you could run over there, check it out. It's a fabulous way to do collaborative work. I do it a lot recently. I've had a couple of collaborations now going with the splice.com site. I'm really happy with what I'm finding there and how it's able to let me do that collaborative work. If you want to try out their sample library, which is in a massive number of loops and sounds, you can also get a free month trial of that library using the Music Art Tech special code in order to get access to the sample library. So, all that being said, lots to talk about. The last thing I want to say is in the podcast, we talk about something called SPLICE. It's different than our sponsor, SPLICE. It's SPLICE as a music ensemble and a music educational organization, and they are splicemusic.org. So let's not get those two confused. Splice.com is the people helping to bring us this stuff for free. Splicemusic.org is the organization that Christopher is actually working with. So with all of that out of the way, let's get into listening to the podcast. Thank you. Okay, today I have the great pleasure of getting a chance to meet somebody new. His name's Chris Biggs. He is involved in all kinds of stuff, all kinds of interesting stuff. First of all, he is a part of Western Michigan, right?
Correct.
I'm supposed to ask that question first. Sorry. Yeah. He's involved in Western Michigan University. He is also, the place where I know him from is a presentation I saw at the SEAMUS Festival last year. It was about something called SPLICE. And SPLICE is kind of a multi-headed beast. I'm going to let Chris talk a little bit about it. And so with that, let's say hello to Chris Biggs. Hey, Chris, how's it going?
Great. How are you?
All right. Thanks a lot for taking the time to talk with us. I appreciate it.
Yep. Happy to be here.
Yeah. So let's start off by having you define yourself. I started doing it and then I just stumbled over my feet. So let's let you do it first.
Cool. Well, I teach at Western Michigan University, mostly in composition and technology. We have a multimedia art technology program, which is kind of a new program that we have that is diverse technology within the arts. And we focus on a lot of things, including interactive stuff, and we teach Macs and things like that. And then my professional work, my research is as a composer. I do lots of live interactive work, including some with video. So that's kind of the center of what I'm doing.
When you say that your work is, you do live interactive stuff, what can you kind of fill in that blank a little bit? What exactly do you mean by that? There's a lot of different versions of that, right?
Yeah, so mostly what I've done for the last 5 or 6 years is things with traditional instruments and electronics, and sometimes with video as well. And, where the instrument is doing stuff and the computer is making things happen in response to that. Sometimes with a cue system where the performer is triggering it, and sometimes it's all automated based on, data extraction from the performer in real time.
Right.
And then where I'm kind of going is more actually performing with electronics, including kind of in a traditional sense with MIDI keyboards and also with the kind of MPE keyboards, the multidimensional polyphonic expression keyboard like the Seaboard Rise or Keith McMillan and things like that.
That's actually interesting. I've been talking to a lot of people about MPE stuff. In fact, recently Synthopia actually sponsored a discussion with a bunch of people involved in MPE. It's really kind of blowing up. I thought, when Rolly was first kind of pushing it, it was, I wasn't sure if it was going to get legs, but man, it seems to have. I think it's the right time for that kind of controller.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me. So I did like a live improvisation set with a jazz ensemble at Western Michigan, like in January. And a lot of the controls that I did was just capturing them and playing things back with MPE capabilities. So that way I can be controlling all those different parameters of the playback at one time.
Right. Do you have any trouble like controlling all the dimensions at once?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, particularly with any degree of fluidity, like or with detail. So it takes some practice. But what I've been doing is kind of just scaling everything non-linearly, right, depending on what what I'm doing. So that way it kind of feels intuitive, and then I just have parameters that change the scaling factor. So that way it works out, I think, pretty well.
The nonlinear part of it actually sounds pretty interesting. I mean, I've seen people doing linear scaling of that stuff just to kind of put like safety bumpers around some of it, but I can see where the nonlinearity would actually kind of make it a little more playable, right?
Yeah, particularly with something like pressure. When you're in a part that feels enthusiastic, it's often too easy to get too high in pressure too fast. So if you just make it so you have to actually press harder to get equally hard in pressure as when you're doing the less, parts that are less exciting to play, maybe, then the outcomes are, I think, more predictable and similar.
Sure. The kind of stuff you're doing also kind of has to tread in that weird zone of being able to be sort of reproducible but still performative. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of a difficult spot to live in, I think, because it can either seem too much press the play button, or it can seem like the woolly ride, and it's hard to get the middle spot in that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Actually, one project I'm doing right now is with a trumpet multimedia artist, composer, Sam Wells, who's part of SPLICE. And we're doing a project called Frob Twiddle Tweak, where we're doing inputs into the system, and the system becomes more and more predictable over time, kind of making a piece around that fact that we're learning how to do this stuff now, and we're working on it, and then the piece follows hopefully the trajectory of our learning.
Right. Yeah, it's like the opposite of what's in the news right now. In the news, all we hear about is machine learning. It's kind of interesting to think of performer learning instead, right? Mm-hmm. So you mentioned SPLICE. Let's talk about that a little bit. Can you explain, first of all, what SPLICE is?
Yeah, so it used to have, we're kind of divorcing it from the acronym, but the acronym was originally the Summer Institute for the Performance, Listening, Interpretation, and Composition of Electroacoustic Music. But now we're just calling it SPLICE because that's simpler and abandon the acronym. But there's three components of it. The most prominent is the Summer Institute. And at that institute, we kind of bring performers and composers together. They work in collaborative teams, or they just attend the workshops. And so we have workshops in the morning that, are from very beginner to very advanced. So we have like 3 simultaneous workshops in max, depending on people's level. We also have like introductory super collider and advanced super collider and things like improvising in Ableton Live and stuff like that. Then the afternoon this year, because our guests will be Sam Pluta and Dana Jessen, who are both very involved in improv, we'll have improv ensembles that will form and work in the afternoons. And all the people who are writing new pieces to premiere will work with their collaborative partners. Then every night we have concerts. And then Saturday is the day of all the works that have been made during the week, including the improv ensembles and the performer-composer pairs. So
that sounds exhausting is what it sounds like.
Yeah, it is. I mean, the pieces are mostly written beforehand, but the getting it together and teaching everyone the technology is it happens during the week. And the goal is that the performers come in maybe with a very little experience with electronics, and then they're trained every day in different performance setups for electronics. And so by the end of the week, the idea is that they can, get a piece from a composer and actually just run the electronics themselves. And so that's the summer institute part. Then we do an electronic music festival that's during the year that's submission based. And we did the first one last year at Western Michigan, and next year it'll be at Bowling Green State University, and Eleni Lilios will host it. And then the other aspect is the SPLICE ensemble, which is the performance faculty for SPLICE Institute, and they do concerts year round and things like that for piano, trumpet, and percussion and electronics.
Who else involved in the ensemble?
Keith Kirchhoff is the pianist, Sam Wells is the trumpet player, and Adam Vidixis is the percussionist.
This seems like like three real different kind of efforts, although, I mean, related but different, right? How do you kind of keep your arms around all of this stuff simultaneously?
We're moving more and more towards kind of a organizational structure that's official. It might be a way to say it, but we've kind of just had people pick up slack where they need to at any given time to make sure that things are happening. The ensemble can kind of manage itself right. Outside of Western Michigan, and then Western Michigan is really the financial center for SPLICE Institute because that's just how it works out most seamlessly because that structure's in place. And then we just try to stay together and try to talk regularly about what's going on and what we need to be doing. And since it's kind of fun and we all like each other, I think that's the real glue that keeps it together.
Sure, I get that, right. When did this start? When did this place, did it start off as the festival or the institute? I mean, it sounds, given the name, it kind of sounds like the institute came first.
Yeah, so the institute completely came first. So that was the heart of it. The other things kind of flowed naturally from the institute. So the institute was the main idea, and then essentially we did some performances at the institute that we wanted to repeat, and there wasn't an opportunity to do so, and that was part of the idea of the festival. We also wanted to do a festival where performers could submit, not like most of them were all composers submitting
right.
To these things. So performers can submit and come and play music without the composer. So we wanted to do something that was in the nature of SPLICE, where it's performer and composer. It's focused on both.
Does the ensemble generally do work from that had been composed for the institute, or are they kind of doing generalized electroacoustic pedagogy?
That's changing, essentially. So there, as you can imagine, there's very few pieces that work for trumpet, piano, and percussion.
Okay, yeah, good point.
So like last summer, there's a piece by Roger Reynolds that actually fits that. So they did that. And they did 2 summers ago, they did Contacta by Stockhausen. I mean, that doesn't have trumpet. But so those kind of things, they wanted an opportunity to repeat. And that was part of why forming the ensemble was there. And then now, as they get repertoire specifically written for them, both through their own activities and through the Institute, that's going to be, I think, more and more the direction, is being able to play as a full trio by having more music written for specifically them.
Sure. How many performances a year do they do?
So I think they've been officially an ensemble outside of the Institute for 2 years, and this year maybe 6 or 7 would be my guess.
Okay.
So they're a guest at Brandeis Beams Festival coming up. They were in residence at Electronic Music Midwest, and they did like New Music Detroit. So this year has been the first year where they've done a lot of activity outside of the Institute.
Yeah, they sound pretty busy. That's great. Let's talk a little bit about the summer program first. Who exactly is this for?
It's a pretty broad range of people in terms of skill set, but it is kind of people who are interested in whatever you want to call it, like electroacoustic music. So, people who are just excited because they've had an electronic music class in their undergrad, all the way to people who are already teaching in an academic institution who want to refine skills either for the creative work or to teach. So it's a broad range in terms of technical skill, but it's kind of focused on the artistic practice surrounding electronic music that's largely within academia.
Sure. And is it oriented specifically towards composers, or do you have people that come specifically for the performance aspect of it?
We have people who come specifically for the performance aspect. Like this year, we'll probably, so looking ahead to this coming summer, probably have 20 some performers and maybe 30 some composers
Okay.
in attendance, will be my guess, maybe a little less than that. We're increasingly getting to the point where we want to be, which is a 50-50 balance between composers and performers.
That's a really interesting direction, interesting mix. I think so often electroacoustic music has been completely wrapped up in composers, you know?
Yeah.
And so it's kind of good to see an effort of bringing performers specifically to work with that kind of music. I think that opens ears and opens some opportunities for getting new people involved, right?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, we've all heard, oh, technology is complicated and things like that. There seems to be a reticence around it, but now things have gotten so much more stable and user friendly that just, we have the performer track where if they have absolutely no background, by the end of the week, the goal is like they can, set up a piece with a click track. They can do basic problem solving if their max patch isn't connected to their interface and all that by the end of the week. And then if they've done that kind of stuff before, there's an advanced performer track where they can get even more detailed. So like, building your own click tracks and maybe setting up a third output channel in Max if you need that or something. So that's been very successful. We've had people who come for the summer program in performance, and then the next year they're doing a whole concert of works for their instrument and electronics now that they're comfortable setting it all up and rehearsing on their own.
Right. So you're kind of like the launch pad for their next year's work, huh?
That might not be the direct goal, but that has happened. And
sure.
The goal is just that people can play pieces without the composer present.
Right. So tell me a little bit about yourself. You're teaching, and you said you teach composition and technology. Is it specifically music technology, or are you kind of play around with media arts, or what kind of technology are you focused on?
So it's always kind of changing, but at present, most of my teaching is in music technology. But I do teach things. I do teach like a class in processing, and I do, when I've taught jitter and things like that. So I do teach some video, but that's not where I am presently emphasized in the program in terms of my teaching. I do mostly the music production side, so people who are making music in the box, in terms of the popular music production that we have, and then. Obviously, on the for the composition majors, it's more like academic electronic music that I teach.
And what was your primary instrument, or what is your primary instrument?
Right, I guess I kind of played piano growing up for a while.
Okay, well, I have to tell you, I am so happy to hear somebody say that, because so often, I'll ask somebody and they'll be like, well, I am, I've got 48 years combined experience on clarinets or whatever. And it's always like one of the things that it strikes me is that a lot of times in electronic music, there's not necessarily a focal instrument as much as the process is almost your instrument, right?
Yeah, and then being adaptable to all the new controllers and whatever kind of outcomes make the most sense. Whatever kind of input process makes the most sense in terms of the output that you want.
Sure.
I played instruments and I had lessons and things like that, but I wasn't prepared to go to an undergraduate music school,
right?
Because I wasn't up enough on an instrument, which is part of what I like about the degree programs we now have at Western Michigan, where composers can have as their applied area as opposed to an instrument. Electronics can be their applied area, so they don't have to have a traditional instrument in order to graduate or to be admitted. And same thing with our technology degree. There's no requirement that they play a traditional instrument. Their ensembles can be live sound reinforcement class and the laptop orchestra.
That is fascinating, because I've always felt like that is really kind of a speed bump to entry into music programs in general, given the fact that music creation now doesn't necessarily have to vector around, high school band, instrument virtuosity, and the ability to follow a conductor. There are many different and new avenues. I felt like music schools oftentimes don't have a place for someone who isn't coming from a traditional high school band scenario.
Yeah, I think that's been a huge problem. And like the people that we're getting applying to this tech program, some of them are really musical and really exciting, but they don't even read music. But they don't read music in the sense that I think music schools think of it, but they read music in the sense that they look at MIDI piano roll, which has the same exact data.
Right.
So they're looking at the same data in actually a fairly similar format. And for some reason, we don't think of that as a method for entry into a school of music, whereas we should. And so we're trying to do that at Western. So you don't have to read music to come in into our tech program. In our music composition program, still got to read music to be admitted.
Sure. That's really interesting from what Western Michigan's doing. How did you manage that in your education? Because quite frankly, that was kind of some of my thing. I mean, I was a guitarist at a time when guitar wasn't very widely accepted as an instrument, so it was as if I didn't have an instrument, and it was really difficult to find any program that was even willing to take you on.
Yeah, so I didn't go to undergraduate. I don't have an undergraduate degree in music. So my undergraduate degree is in journalism, and I ended up getting a minor in music. I did try to pursue audio engineering for 1 year, but it wasn't. I wanted to be creating stuff. I didn't really like just the focus on recording other people's music. So
setting up microphones for the orchestra, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So I did that for 1 year at Indiana University, and then I switched to a journalism program and did a music minor. And then I was just very fortunate to be admitted to a master's composition program. Kind of accidentally, because they just looked at my portfolio and admitted me, and then it wasn't until I got there and they're like, wait, you can't be here, you don't have an undergrad in music. I'm like, well, it's a little late.
What school is that?
The University of Arizona.
Oh, well, God bless them. Good for them. I like it. That's great. So how did you get into music and production and music tech in the first place? I mean, it sounds like, you kind of have a non-traditional education. What is your background that even got you into it?
I did have some piano lessons and sax lessons and things like that, and I had good teachers particularly when I was very young. I stopped kind of in high school because I didn't like my teachers as much. But then the thing that got me really just invested in sound and kind of noise making as a creative practice, not just playing my scales and things, was my brother was in a band, and they got a 4-track, but then they didn't use it very much. And that's what I did, like, every day after school. I would just play, use whatever I could find and make sound into this 4-track. And then my brother and I, after he wasn't really playing with that band anymore, my brother and I spent a huge amount of time just making sound into this 4-track and doing different stuff with it.
So one thing I'm always interested in for people is how they expanded the way that their hearing works, right? So let's face it, we all come up through life. We listen to radio, we get a sense from the other kids at school what cool music is. We get a sense of what's hip and what's not. And then some of us gravitate towards the sound of gravel in a can or something, right? And I'm curious to see what was the thing that got you to sort of like extend your mind and your hearing beyond just pop music.
It's funny how I feel like the answer I'm about to give is intensely typical in a sense. So, there's a few things. Like, so Frank Zappa was interesting, and then I read that he liked Edgar Varese.
Yes.
And then the other thing was I thought Mr. Bungle was amazing, like Disco Volante. I thought that was like the best album. And then I saw that there was a sax player, and I played some sax on the back, and his name was John Zorn. He was on one of the tracks. And then I looked up John Zorn, and then I would get a disc, and I'd be like, what is happening?
Right.
And then I would get another disc, and it would be completely different. And then I was like, oh, and there's a whole label. And so I just ate that stuff up, and I was excited about it. And then, you just read about other things and get into new composers. And some of the bands that I listened to were kind of odd, like early Ween. They were kind of from where I was. And I remember listening to it when I was like 13 and thinking that this was just was garbage, kind of. And then one night being like, wait, this is actually really interesting. I can listen to this in a different way.
Right. Yeah. I'm sorry, but the this is garbage thing, that actually is a I think that is a super typical thing. The sort of the feeling of coming back to something, be like, boy, I sure wasn't ready back then, but I'm ready now. So now that you're teaching and you're playing and all this kind of stuff, what are you doing to sort of like continue the growth curve? I think one of the things that there's an assumption about is that people work really hard to get into academia and then just sort of like press the clutch and let it roll out, you know? But you're like extraordinarily active and you're doing a lot of stuff. What are the things that you do to keep pushing yourself?
Well, I'm pretty lucky where I am at Western Michigan because we have a good number of composers in town, and we get together and we kind of push each other. We have a kind of like pact that we don't want to become complacent with our art making or our tenure, you know, as we get. And then also like SPLICE Institute and the people I work with through there, and just preparing materials for all the people who come, you know, really helps me push myself. Students, I try to, you know, learn new things to help students all the time, and that helps me push myself. You know, I just think it's like trying to make it fun and exciting all at the same time, and being within these communities keeps me enthusiastic and working.
So where is Western Michigan located?
It's in Kalamazoo, Michigan.
Okay.
Which is famous for Bell's beer, I think, is where we're
right.
most famous
it's
for
maybe
that.
not. It's maybe not famous for having a pack of composers. I mean, how is it? Just people from the school, or are there people hanging around the town that consider themselves composers as well?
There had been some people hanging around the town, but we have a surprising number of composers in the School of Music, not all of whom are on the composition faculty. You know, so like maybe 3 to 5 of us at any given time are trying to like get together once or twice a semester and just critique each other's work and stuff like that.
That's really cool. I quite frankly, I haven't talked to very many people that have that story or have been willing to have that story. The closest is some of the people in LA, you know, the composers that are in professional work. There's a couple of groups that have kind of cabals that run around and push each other a little bit. But I've not heard that in academia. And I've always been a little bit surprised because I thought that would be, you know, a school is kind of a natural focal point for this kind of thing. And I would think that there would be more of that kind of camaraderie around people's artistic practice.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think at many places at many different times, there's things that impede people getting along optimally or being comfortable with each other. You know,
like what? Like what?
Like people are at different stages in their process at the institution, and so some people are authority and some people are subject to other people's authority, which makes meetings and talking about each other's work maybe less honest or productive or comfortable.
Right.
And then, you know, at different times, people are competitive with resources or they want certain students and things like that. And I just think we're very fortunate that we get along really well and that we set up processes to try to make it so we don't end up with those kind of conflicts that I think are fairly typical at institutions.
Yeah, there is a weird competition in academia that I never was able to completely wrap my head around. It's always seemed a little odd because you would think it would be a little bit like it's us against the world, but no, it's so often seems kind of like, well, it's me against everybody else. And so it tends to lead towards really solitary work often.
Mm-hmm. And I could be wrong, but I feel like that might be changing a bit because, I don't know, it just seems like the plurality of things means that fewer people are in as direct competition. That might kind of change it up in terms of how directly competitive people feel with one another. But I could be wrong about that for sure.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, one of the things I'm a little more interested in too is this idea of sort of like the way that Western Michigan has kind of put together a mechanism for allowing people into their program that might be coming from different backgrounds. I'll just state that I think that that's a fantastic thing, but I also think that it's going to be required to have creative people get involved in music education, because I swear it's a direction that creative people go, and if that's being kind of like, if the door's shut on these people in terms of getting into music education, we're not going to get the best candidates for that work, you know?
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting kind of it's very self-fulfilling. So schools are taking in people out of band programs essentially, and then they are in music education programs that have fairly stringent requirements from the accrediting body and the state. And then they get kind of basic skills on most instruments, and the idea is that they're going to go to a high school or wherever else and conduct a band, a concert band or a marching band or whatever else. And then those are the kind of students that are recruited, and those are the kind of students that come. So it seems like this unbreakable cycle.
Yeah.
But if it would be a really inspiring thing for schools to start thinking about what should music education be in elementary schools, in 5 years, or should have been 5 years ago.
Right.
Like that we break the kind of reliance on instrumental models as the only justifiable thing to teach in schools, and start thinking of the laptop as the folk instrument of the 21st century.
It's interesting, though, you put it that way, though, that it's the folk instrument, because one of the things that has always kind of been the case is a real long lag time between a folk instrument becoming popular and a folk instrument becoming accepted by academia.
That's an excellent point.
And I don't know why that is, other than maybe the lack of pedagogy or something. I don't know. Or, the lack of clear curricular focus. I don't know. What do you think? What do you think might be some of the leading issues on that?
Well, I think I think two things come to my mind immediately. One is that the amount of failure involved might not be comfortable. So like the number of pieces that are going to be bad, the number of controllers that aren't going to work, the number of controllers that are just going to be boring to watch people do. Like, is that person checking their email, or are they making music? So the number of things that won't work might not be comfortable. So until it seems like it's working, maybe people will be slow to think like, oh, this is really cool and this is valuable. The other thing is that I think it's terrifying. I mean, I think of myself as someone who's constantly trying to change and do new things and adapt, but it's even nerve-wracking for me as you think about like how you're going to be outmoded over time. And then when we're involved in hiring processes and things like that, we're often looking for people we can understand. And then, and if we're getting to the point where we might not understand why something is going to be interesting in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, then we're likely to just self-perpetuate similar systems.
Now, the other thing is with SPLICE and do you have a similar perspective with performers and composers at SPLICE, basically letting them in the door even if their instrument or their focus is around, I don't know, like a Native Instruments machine controller? Is that part of the game?
So far it has not been. I think part of it is that we're attracting mostly what we are.
I see.
And that we like what we are. If that makes sense.
It totally does.
Yeah, we're like super stoked to be getting, everyone, from the students who are just like figuring out as composers or performers if they want to be doing this stuff. And then they tend to come just for the workshops. And then we're really stoked that we're getting like, doctoral students and people who are already already done their degrees come in to just learn new stuff and get caught up, or to learn to perform with electronics so that way they can teach their students how to perform with electronics if they're teaching instrumental performance somewhere. So I think that's really what we've become when we first started, and we're not like, this is just going to be our fourth year. We weren't sure if we were going to be able to be that. So we flew out a broad net, and then we attracted mostly what we are. We're very enthusiastic about that. So yeah, it's very different. Like the SPLICE Institute and SPLICE in general is more of a similar, like the music composition program I'm part of. Whereas, like the technology program I teach at Western is more like if someone comes in and they're using DJ-based tools to do their performance during their interview, that's like really awesome. Right. Or if they're rapping, that's like really awesome. If they play clarinet, that's fine.
Do you think that there's going to be an opportunity for either some of these technologies, or in my mind, especially some of the music styles. I mean, do you think there's going to be a time where there's going to be a natural movement of people who are, say, hip hop beat makers to be able to find a place in academia in a way that doesn't exist even now? I mean, now if you want to do school in that kind of stuff, you generally still are looking at like some of these institutes. We have one here in Minneapolis. Slam Academy does a great job of like doing DJing and dance music and music production stuff, right? For people who are coming from a hip hop or a real EDM or dance music background, is there a way for that to get drawn into the academic thing? Is there enough rigor there? Is there a way to apply rigor in a way that might make it fit in an academic environment?
I think there's a lot of approaches. Like my mind went like I think 5 different places when you were
Okay.
talking about that. But
all right.
One thing I would say is like like what we're doing at Western Michigan anyway is trying to give people who are interested in EDM and things a broad array of technology skills so they can have a variety of outcomes, and we call it like a Bachelor of Science. So they get to make their beats and do that music production, but they also have to, do a bunch of other stuff, including computer programming, things like that. But in terms of really like if you can, I'm not sure if you're asking if like you can kind of just like go to school with the idea that you're going to do that kind of thing. I think there can totally be enough rigor to it and to a program to allow that to happen. I think place my mind goes that's negative is that schools that are struggling are just going to see dollar signs on kids' forehead.
Right.
And, take them and take way too many people and really like focus on a very narrow thing that person's interested in, or show them,
just to keep them writing checks.
Yeah. Particularly like I'm in a state institution, particularly as like various academic institutions are experiencing financial strain.
Right.
I hope that as schools maybe decide to be broad, which obviously I'm enthusiastic about, and try to open up to a different kind of music student and things like that they're doing it for the reasons that they think it's going to make a better cultural environment internally in the institution, and that they're going to put out really interesting people who are doing cool work, not just that it's going to increase their enrollment.
Right. Well, I think that's one part of the reason I asked that question, but there's another part which goes back to what you were saying, which is that, you have this tendency to attract your own and to find attractive those who are like you, right? How can diversity happen in music programs when there's no history of it and there's not it's not easy to say, well, we can embrace people that don't exactly look or act or play like us, right?
Yeah, and that's the funny thing that might be the good thing about the financial strain is that it will put pressure on institutions to try to diversify and to look for new markets of students. And in our program, one of the things we're doing is we actually have a marker, like how distinct are this person's interests compared to the other people that are applying in every given year.
Oh, that's
to try
awesome.
to try to have stylistic diversity in the music making, and also because we want people who are like interested in developing apps for cell phones and things like that. So how do we get people who are more like technically focused, who are more focused on different genres and styles, people who want to do live sound with people who want to do recording, with people who want to be making music, and then what do those people get to do together when they get to form groups and do work?
I think that's something that a lot of people don't even think about happening, is this idea of you as an academic kind of fishing around for mechanisms that you can use to open things wider as well. That's pretty cool. Well, Chris, I want to ask you a little bit about your personal practice, because you dropped something else and it made me want to ask you about it. You said, people have different controllers and you have to be, you never know which controllers are going to work, which are going to fall apart. You have mentioned a lot of different controllers, but you haven't even talked to, you seem very shy about talking about your favorite thing or your focus thing or whatever. I mean, is there a controller that you feel like is a big part of your expression, or is there some like physical device for interaction, or is it completely abstracted by the laptop?
Well, no, so I'm not shy about it. It's just where I'm going,
I
not
see.
as much what I'm doing. But like the performance set I was working on, like right before we started this, is just a traditional MIDI keyboard
Okay.
and a Keith McMillan Q Nexus. I think Keith McMillan stuff is great.
Yeah.
And then the next piece I'm going to be working on is for a pianist for Seaboard Rise and piano. And I think I've been playing with the Seaboard Rise a bit. I think that that's phenomenal. And honestly, I love them all in their own way. Like I love the Novation Launchpad. Obviously, like for people who like Ableton, the push is ridiculous.
Right,
The
right.
way it interfaces, it's just so elegant, and it's a really beautiful thing. So I would say that I like them all. Part of what I was saying before was more like what's interesting for the audience for someone to be performing
I see.
with,
Right.
and I'm trying to figure out like how I'm gonna do this. Like how am I gonna kind of be make this transition from largely composing for other people to being on the stage making electronics in real time with people, and how I'm going to maintain that as an interesting phenomena for the audience, because right now I'm just loving all of it. Like I just like putting together the programming in Max and getting stuff working, and then hearing the sounds and then tweaking and making it getting it to a state where I think it's really cool. And then I need to make sure that I'm getting to the next level where I'm thinking, how is my physical gesture related to the sonic outcome in a way that's dynamic, that means that being on stage is sensible.
Right, right. Well, and you're giving the kind of cues that allow the audience to be part of the performance, or at least
Hmm.
to appreciate the performance. And so you talk about working with Max and processing, and you mentioned Super Collider. I know you guys teach Super Collider. I'm not sure if you're a user or not, but how much of your work is like really focused on that kind of programming activity as part of the work?
Recently, almost all of it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so Max is really the core of what I do. And then I got into processing, and because I needed to teach a scripting language
Okay.
for at school, so I needed to be doing that. And I thought processing was an amazing entry language for people. I think it's great. And then after learning processing, you go back to the kind of object based with the kind of patch cable based structure, and it seems annoying. Um, but then I use JavaScript in Max, and
Right.
that really solves that problem for me. And I'm like super excited about what's going on with Gen. So I've been learning Gen. So a lot of the projects I've been doing are in part just to get better with my understanding about digital signal processing and also with coding. So that way I can teach those things better for students. And then also, you get better outcomes in your own work when part of your creative practice, I think, involves technical challenges for yourself.
Sure, sure. Where do you think things are going to go for you in the future?
I mean, immediately I'm just looking at how I'm going to kind of hopefully transition from mostly writing for other people to writing for myself and other people in terms of being an electronic music performer. So that's like my next stage. And then beyond that, I'm not sure. I'm really excited about the potential of doing more improv with electronics with jazz players.
Uh-huh.
Which I did with a student group in January, and I think I'm going to do with a jazz saxophonist at Western Michigan in about a year and a half. We're going to try to do an album with live electronics and saxophone and piano. I have about a year and a half planned, and then beyond that, I'm not sure.
Well, I just have to tell you from my own experience doing that kind of thing, working with jazz players, it's an amazing experience because their reactivity is so much different than other kinds of musicians. It's a completely different and pretty wonderful experience.
It's called the Advanced Jazz Quartet or Advanced Jazz Ensemble at Western that I worked with, and
Okay.
I've been seeing chamber music coachings for new music at Western and things like that as we have guest composers and stuff come in. And I've always been amazed by how hard chamber music has been for many of the students at Western. Just like getting it together, breathing together, being in time, really adding expression to the music beyond just playing it in time.
Right.
And then I'm doing this project with these jazz students, and that's what they just live and breathe and do.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're having high level music conversation immediately. They're chaining off. They're just making decisions in real time that are very interesting. So the pieces can be radically different from time to time. It was
Right.
it was a really beautiful thing to watch them play.
That sounds amazing. Chris, our time is already up, but before we go, I would like you to just give us a quick rundown for people that are interested in in potentially getting involved, where would they find more information?
SPLICEmusic.org has information about the SPLICE Ensemble, the SPLICE Institute, and SPLICE Festival.
Yeah, and when is the SPLICE Festival?
Yeah, SPLICE Festival will be at Bowling Green State University from November 8th to November 10th this coming fall.
Awesome. Well, Chris, I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule to have this chat. It's been great talking to you. It's been great to hear more about SPLICE, but also more about your work as well as your work with students and your kind of vision for academia. It's really been an interesting talk.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, no worries. Well, with that, I'm going to let you go. Have a great one.
You too.
Bye. Well, I want to thank Christopher for spending the time talking to me, and I apologize to him and to everybody for having had this sit on a shelf for a while, but I think it's still very relevant to where everybody's at and the kind of things that are happening over at Western Michigan. Thank you to you, the listeners. Thank you to SPLICE.com for their support of this podcast and for helping to keep it free for all of us. And thank you, the listeners, for showing up every week and making this podcast a success. With that, I'm going to let you go. Have a great one. Bye.